Subjectivism, relativism, and objectivism. Problems and benefits. So we're going to start with subjectivism. Subjectivism is the view that there can be different moral standards for different people. Each standard is based on that person's moral beliefs and practices at a given time, and consists of the moral values and principles that hold for that person at that time. So, to understand this view, I'm going to read a little story. To appreciate the implications of subjectivism, imagine that you've been standing in line at the theater. Suddenly, a strange man steps into the line right in front of you. How would you react? You'd certainly object, telling him that he has no right to cut in front of so many people, and that he should go to the end of the line. And notice that if you aren't quite brave or forthright enough to do this, presumably someone else in the line will be. And you might add that it's not fair for him to cut in the line when no one else has. Note a few things about this very natural reaction. First, you're making moral claims here about fairness, rights, and what this man ought to do. In making these claims, you imply that the same obligations or rights hold for him no less than for everybody else. Moreover, you seem to assume that he, along with everybody else, already knows these things. All of this is part of the intuition that the same moral principles hold for everyone. The man now makes an extraordinary reply. "I'm sorry," he says politely, "for I see that the fairness and rights you've just appealed to must hold for you. Perhaps they hold for other people here as well. You have my sincere sympathy, for I can imagine how inconvenient these principles of yours must be. I bet you've been standing here for some time, right? What you must understand, however, is that these principles don't happen to hold for me. Each of us is bound by our own set of moral principles, you know. You have a principle of fairness. Fortunately for me, I do not. Please don't misunderstand. I always do my best to live an upright and moral life, and if fairness were one of my principles, I wouldn't dream of cutting in front of you. However, it's not one of my principles, and so I'm perfectly within my rights to cut in front of you. As you probably didn't realize this when you started complaining, I assure you that I take no offense. I hope when you started complaining, we've now cleared up this little misunderstanding. By the way, can you step back a little? You're crowding me." This is the speech of a subjectivist. Would you stand for it? None of us really believes for a moment that this argument has any legitimacy. But notice that this is the world of the subjectivist. There's also a deeper problem with subjectivism. If subjectivism were true, you'd never be able to assume that a moral principle that holds for you would also hold for anybody else. This seems to conflict with morality's primary function, which is to regulate how individuals relate to each other. So instead of giving us a different version of morality, subjectivism just gives us something that's a lot closer to no morality at all. Now remember, this doesn't mean that you can't accept subjectivism as your metaethical view. It just means that you need to have some way of responding to this problem. All right, let's move on to relativism. Remember that relativism is the view that there can be different moral standards for different societies. Each standard, based on that society's moral beliefs and practices, consists of moral values and principles that hold for all members of that particular society. There's a few problems with relativism. One might be that it makes anything morally right. Another is that it means that moral reformers must be condemned. A third is that it makes moral progress incoherent. And a fourth problem with relativism is that it requires us to choose a single social group to dictate our morality. We'll take each of these problems in turn. The first problem, that it makes anything morally right. If we accept moral relativism, then this means that slavery was morally right in any society that accepted it. But we might wonder, is slavery ever morally right? This is an open and interesting question, I think. This holds for any practice that's accepted widely by a society, right? Especially any practice that we now determine is not morally right. For example, the Greeks had a habit of exposing their children if they had any sort of deformity, right? If a child is born with a deformity, the Greeks would leave the child out in the cold so that it would die. Now, presumably today, we think that this is morally abhorrent. But if we accept that relativism is true, then we can't reasonably hold this position. What do you think? The second problem that relativism brings up is with moral reformers. If moral relativism is true, then we must condemn moral reformers. So do we think that we should have condemned Martin Luther King Jr. when he was working? Now, certainly many people did condemn him, but notice that if we accept relativism, what we're saying is that we're morally required to condemn Martin Luther King or any other moral reformer. What do you think? It also makes moral progress incoherent. Moral progress requires some objective moral standard that we're moving towards. But this is exactly what relativism denies. Relativism says that a society's moral standards is what that society believes and practices. So any changes aren't progress, right? But they're instead abandoning the practices required by the moral standard. So this is kind of an interesting point. The idea is that progress wouldn't happen the way that we think it would, right? Generally speaking, we think that moral progress happens, that we eventually discover that something that we were doing that was wrong is in fact wrong, and so we make adjustments according to that, right? But notice that according to relativism, we can't say this, because instead what we're doing is abandoning the practices required by the moral standard. This is an interesting problem, I think. So what do you think? Another problem is that a single social group is supposed to dictate our morality. And this is actually a cluster of problems. So relativism says that your morality is that of the social group that you belong to. So this can be the social group, country, or the community that you belong to. So which social group or community do you belong to? It's probably clear which country that you belong to. Maybe, but maybe not. However, it seems like we all belong to various social groups and communities. So how can we decide which one defines our individual morality? And then there's also a deeper problem going on here, that if the morality of these groups conflict, how are we supposed to determine which one is primary? So, what do you think of this problem? Okay, so now we're going to move on to objectivism, and how this part of the presentation is going to proceed is that we're going to look at a variety of formal arguments against objectivism, and then we're going to develop responses to those objections so that we can kind of see how this back and forth works. Now, remember that objectivism is the view that there's only one universal moral standard. That standard, based on objective moral facts, consists of moral values and principles that hold universally for all people and all societies. The problems that we're going to look at are that objectivity requires absolutism, all truth is subjective, equal rights implies equal plausibility, and the absence of categorical reasons undermines moral objectivity. Now, if you're looking at this list and you're like, oh my God, I don't understand what any of those words mean, don't worry. We're going to explain them as we get there. All right, as for the first view, or problem, that objectivity requires absolutism. So this involves the following argument. if moral claims are objectively true, then moral rules are absolute. Okay, that makes sense. No moral rule is absolute, something that I think that many of us might want to accept. Therefore, moral claims are not objectively true. All right, that makes sense. So, an absolute moral rule is one that's always wrong to break with no exceptions. This would seem to be a requirement of objectivity. So, this argument suggests that when it comes to morality, being objective and being absolute go hand in hand. However, notice that there's nothing in the idea of an objective morality that requires moral rules to be absolute. So, to help us here, we can introduce a distinction between status versus stringency. So, the objectivity of moral rules has to do with their status, right? With whether they're correct independent of our opinion of them. The absoluteness of moral rules has to do with their stringency, which is whether or not it's ever okay to break them. But there's no direct connection between matters of status and matters of stringency. So this is clear when we consider things like natural laws. Various biological and psychological laws admit of exceptions, and so are not absolute, even though they are objective. Okay, so for example, Emery's rule, which is a rule in zoology, noticed by Carlo Emery, states that insect social parasites are often closely related to their hosts, such as being in the same genus. However, Emery's rule is not absolute, but it is objective, right? So that means that there can be exceptions to Emery's rule, right? So it's not the case that every insect social parasite is closely related to their host. However, it is objective, this rule, meaning that we can look in the world and see it functioning out there. All right. Here is another objection. All truth is subjective. This argument begins with the first premise: there are no objective truths, and the conclusion: so there are no objective moral truths. Maybe many of us find this argument compelling. Premise 1, however, is either true or false. But if it's false, then the argument crumbles right away. This, of course, is how a one-premise argument works. But what if it's true? Well, it turns out that this is impossible. It can't be true. If it were true, there'd be at least one objective moral truth, right? The first premise. And if this is true, then premise 1 is false. Okay? So there are at least some objective moral truths. Now notice that none of these objective truths have to be moral, but this argument isn't going to work to show us this. All right? So this is an interesting sort of problem that comes from this argument, that there are no objective truths, so there are no objective moral truths. All right. Equal rights imply equal plausibility. Here's how this objection goes. If everyone has equal right to an opinion, then all opinions are equally plausible. Everyone has equal right to his or her moral opinions. Therefore, all moral opinions are equally plausible. If all moral opinions are equally plausible, then ethical objectivism is false, right? That makes sense. So ethical objectivism is false. Now, I think that sometimes many of us, when we first come into ethics, hold an argument that's very similar to this. But notice, from the claim that we each have a right to our opinions, nothing at all follows from their plausibility. Okay? So we can see this when we're interacting with an expert, right? So, for example, many people in our class, I know, play sports at BMCC. We have some people, I think, who play soccer and baseball and basketball and rodeo. And in any of those cases, I think I would definitely consider you all experts at the sport that you're playing at BMCC. However, if I was going to interact with you, for example, about rodeo, my opinion doesn't matter, right? Because I am not an expert. Our views are not equally plausible with an expert's view on a topic, even though I have as much right to my opinions as the expert does, right? The first premise of the argument confuses two entirely separate matters: whether a person has a right to an opinion and whether that opinion has any merit. All right, so the fourth objection is an objection that's going to get us somewhere. So this objection involves the absence of categorical reasons undermining moral objectivity. So here's how this argument proceeds. If there are objective moral duties, then there are categorical reasons to obey them. There are not categorical reasons. Therefore, there are no objective moral duties. It's reasonable. If there are objective moral duties, then there are categorical reasons to obey them. There are not categorical reasons. Therefore, there are no objective moral duties. All right. A categorical reason is a reason that applies to us regardless of what we care about. All right? So a categorical reason is a reason that applies to us regardless of what we care about. If we go to the argument again, if there are objective moral duties, then there are categorical reasons to obey them, right? Reasons that are independent of what we care about. But these reasons that are independent of what we care about don't exist. Therefore, there are no objective moral duties. A categorical reason is a reason that applies to us regardless of what we care about. But most of our reasons for doing things depend on what matter to us. Think about why you make the decisions that you do. So many people object to the idea that categorical reasons exist at all. We might reject premise 1 and deny that objective moral duties must supply us with reasons for action. It may be that some people have no reason to do what morality requires of them. Whether there are objective moral standards is one thing, and whether they supply us with reasons to obey them is another thing entirely. We can also stand by premise 1, right? Think that it's good, but try rejecting premise 2. On this view, objective moral duties really do provide categorical reasons, and these reasons exist. And there are reasons to behave in certain ways, even if such behaviors don't benefit us or satisfy all of our desires. To make this reply a success, however, we need to reject the popular view of reasons. And this view says that you have a reason to do something only if doing it will promote self-interest or get you what you care about. Right? This is called ethical egoism, and we're going to look at this in a couple of chapters, right? So in order to respond to this objection, we have to object to psychological egoism, which is a broadly held view. And so this raises serious problems for moral objectivity. All right. So that was kind of a furious overview of some objections there at the end. If you're still a little bit confused about the objections to objectivity, that's okay. We'll figure it out as we go along. So in this presentation so far, we considered objections to subjectivism, relativism, and objectivism in order to raise problems with each view. And then when we were considering objections to objectivism, we also considered responses to some of these objections in order to avoid some common mistakes about objectivism. Now, it's important to remember that regardless of which metaethical view we choose, each view has problems that we need to be able to respond to. And again, our three metaethical views. Objectivism, that there's only one universal moral standard, and that standard, based on objective moral facts, consists of moral values and principles that hold universally for all people in all societies. Relativism, that there can be different moral standards for different societies, right? And each standard, based on that society's moral beliefs and practices, consists of moral values and principles that hold for all members of that particular society. And subjectivism, that there can be different moral standards for different people. Each standard, based on that person's moral beliefs and practices at a given time, consists of the moral values and principles that hold for each person at that time.